lot of brands jump to the conclusion, to your point, where they're like, well, they're worried about their consumer reaction. And what I would say with anything you're hearing from me is this is all in the spirit of experimentation.
A/B test it.
Right. So the point is like, what do you have to lose?
Yeah.
Absolute worst case scenario, you take a segment of users and you shift basically a variant to them, and they have a slightly different experience, and it loses. I mean, okay, sure, maybe you lost some revenue from a segment of users there, and I understand that, but like, at what cost to not test it all?
Welcome to Chew On CRO. It's probably the first time you guys are hearing this. It's because it's our new series that we've just begun with Ned from Endrock. We learned how much you guys loved CRO from our Chew On This episode with Ned a couple of months ago. And we got so much inbound to have him back on an episode and have him come and share more information that we just decided to turn it into a completely new series. Chew On CRO will focus fully on CRO, going into 20 to 30 minute episodes talking about what you need to do for your brand to accelerate your CRO opportunities. So without further ado, let's kick this series off with Ned, who's come from Enrock. He'll give a little bit of your intro too, just for the people who haven't got an opportunity to find out who you are and what you've done. And then we'll kick off today's topic after that.
Awesome, man. Yeah, thanks for having me back. Yeah, it's super exciting. There's a ton of different data points, strategies, everything we're going to be talking about today. So yeah, for those who didn't see the first episode, a little bit of my background is I have a background in statistics and got started in the direct-to-consumer e-commerce space about 6-7 years ago by working with brands to just rebuild their analytics stacks. Most brands were kind of a mess on that front, you know, and we talked about it at length. They just didn't really have any of the reporting infrastructure set up, a lot of data hygiene problems, you know, for those that were trying to infer insights, a lot of type 1, type 2 errors, a lot of false positives, a lot of mistaken correlation and causation, just like the classic stuff you see in just fundamental data analytics. And so I basically, you know, started rebuilding these stacks and then would just always see these anomalous data points on clients. You know, they'd just be super under indexed here on this channel, or one of their inter-funnel rates on their site, like one of the micro conversion rates would just be abnormally low or high performing. And I assumed they knew this and that they were basically operating under the pretenses that they were going to try to improve that metric or lever it. None were, right? And that's okay, you know, and so I started to bring it up to them like, okay, you know, there's a metric on fire here, so to speak, you know, I assume you guys are going to be overhauling this page, and they'd always just be like, you know, we didn't know that. That's really interesting. How'd you find it? Do you have any ideas? So I'd give them ideas. Of course, not many of those ideas ever came to fruition on their end. So I basically went back to them and said, I'd love to run some experimentation, right? And that was the beginning of the quote experiment days. So did that for a few years as just a sole operator, and then started building the agency in 2019. So as of today, we've grown a ton, even just since the last podcast. So we actually cracked over 100 clients now. We're 101 clients, wow. 80 people on the team, and scaling quickly, and yeah, just adding a ton of value. So yeah, what we'll talk about today is getting into some of the real meat of it, I think.
Absolutely.
Some that's really, really true to my heart is getting into GA specifically. And so obviously we're at this, you know, where we're talking right now, we're kind of right at that cutover between GA3 and GA4, et cetera. So I'm going to talk about both today. Reason being is I found a ton of clients still haven't set their GA4s up properly. And so they either didn't set them up properly, or they did it so late before the cutoff that they don't have a lot of historical data to reference in GA4, right? And so, or it wasn't set up for whatever reason, a lot of the event architecture isn't there. So I am going to use some GA3 reports here, which most brands and most people watching this, you can still access that. And for those watching, you should still have a bit of time here where you can continuously access your GA3 data before it disappears forever. Right? That being said, quick side note, if you do want to keep your GA3 data, you can do so. Right, you can do this.
You got Ash excited now.
How do you do that?
Yeah, it's
asking for a friend.
It's a secret. Yeah, it's a secret password. You have to type it. No, it's asking for a friend. So it ultimately relates to BigQuery. So you can get some of that data and then historically put it into effectively a structured data warehouse that you can query and access at any time in the future. So strongly recommend that for any brands, especially if you're over a certain revenue mark. Really important that you you take care of that. So. Okay. Yeah. So happy to dive into it.
Let's do it.
Any questions? Kind of, just jump in. As you guys know, I tend to speak
I
pretty fast, so just
definitely
jump in
will.
anytime. Cool. So let's just talk about high-level metrics, right? So I mean, here up on the screen now, these are traditionally known as the vanity metrics or the superficial metrics. A little bit of an unfair naming convention to them. The reason we call it that in the industry is because not any one of these is really that indicative to your growth as a brand. It's almost like, who cares what your bounce rate is if your conversion rate's really good? On one hand, it kind of doesn't matter. However, they're excellent leading indicators as to what's going on down funnels. So I always like to start here just to get a feel for the brand and really want to explain everybody how to look at this report and what matters and kind of what doesn't matter. So a few things is, one is just the obvious traffic trend. Right, so you're looking at year to date, quarter to date, what have you, and it's like, where are we trending, right? I mean, if you were to effectively create a linear progression on this, if you're creating, just a linear understanding, are we trending downwards? Are we trending upwards? Obviously, no matter all the CRO work you do, if you're bleeding users to the site, you're not going to grow revenue, right? Period. So channel diversification, channel expansion, obviously always of paramount importance. So that's kind of an obvious one to always take a look at. Second one, a little bit less known, is the relationship between pages per session and session duration. A lot of people look at these as metrics in isolation, like, oh, our PPS is 2.5 or 3 or whatever, that's good. But it's not about so much what your PPS, pages per session, is compared to your session duration or your session duration individually. It's when you compare them together. As an example, what you're looking at here on the screen, this is a brand that has pretty solid pages per session, right? 2.5, pushing even 3 when you're looking at certain windows. That means the average user is getting deep into the site. However, look at the session duration. It's barely 1 minute. And keep in mind, that's session duration. That's not engagement time. Engagement time is always a fraction of that, sometimes considerably less. So this brand in this case actually has an engagement rate of about 35 seconds. So it's a bit of a misleading metric to be like, oh, our pages per session is good, we're doing well. It's like, well, not so fast. This is very typical superficial browsing behavior. So the average user behavior is they get deep into the site, but they don't spend hardly any time anywhere. So how much education are they adopting? How much of your unique selling proposition are they actually absorbing? And remember, that's 30, 35 seconds engagement time total. That includes the people who purchase, entering their information, all of that. So that's a huge chunk of it. So if you were to exclude that, call it like the outlier audience, I mean, we're dealing with what, 10, 15, 20 seconds?
Crazy.
I mean, fractions of time that most people think they have with users here. So don't let the pages per session metric fool you. You want to look at the relationship between that and session duration to kind of understand what's really going on. And then the next metric that kind of layers on top of that effectively reinforces this is bounce rate. So bounce rate, generally speaking in e-com, you want to keep it sub 60. If you're over 60%, you're definitely on the higher end compared to, I've done this, I don't know how many hundreds of brands
What's
at this point.
world-class percentage?
Sub 40.
Sub 40.
Yeah, sub 40. So any brands that are sub 40, if you find yourself 38, 39, you are dialed in. Honestly, I would say that's really solid. Target 40, 45, maybe just sub 50. When you start creeping into the 50s, like, you're technically okay, but you're getting closer to that 60%, which is effectively, for me, the line in the sand to start to get problematic. But you look at this, I mean, we're at a 71%. So right out of the gates, that absolutely supports, because even though we do have some users, let's call those the target, who are actually moving deep funnel, the vast majority never make it past the landing or home page. And they come in, they browse around a little bit, they never click or engage with anything, hence the high bounce rate, and then they're out. So again, a couple things you can look at here to really see where your brand stacks up, and then start to give some of this feedback back to your team to drive better opportunity.
When you say bounce rate, right? I think there's like so many differing definitions on it. How would you define it? Is it somebody who's come to the website, literally kind of just scrolls, doesn't click on anything, doesn't engage in anything, and then leaves?
Sure. So let's create a user story out of it, right? So two different scenarios. So Ash, the exit rate, Ron, the bounce rate, right? Ash comes to the site, lands, and he goes, this isn't what I was looking for. This isn't at all what I was looking for. And you leave within seconds, like pretty quickly. You don't scroll, you don't engage. You're looking for dog products, you land on a cat product site, right? You're like, no, this is wrong. And then you leave. That's an exit.
Okay.
But
Ron,
under any time jurisdiction, like
no, exit rates are within a very confined period of time.
Cool.
Yeah. Now, the bounce rate, right? So Ron's experience is he lands and he goes, yeah, no, this is what I was looking for, right? I'm trying to articulate this in an actual user story, right? So he lands, says, yeah, this is what I was looking for. He scrolls down and eventually basically says to the website, okay, sell me to stay. Convince me to stay. Convince me to actually progress into your product experience, to which the site fails to do so. He reads a little bit. Maybe there's an automatic video plays. He doesn't click on anything, but he reads a little bit. He scrolls. He looks at some of the images, and then he leaves. Right? So 2 different user experiences there. One should be defined as bounce rate. One should be defined as exit rate. If you've got a really high exit rate, I mean, you're just completely missing the mark. You know what I mean? Either completely wrong audience or completely wrong value proposition. Again, selling, cat products to dog owners, right? Type of thing. If you have a high bounce rate, that doesn't necessarily mean you have the wrong audience. You still could have channel market fit. However, you're not selling it right. You're not explaining it. The value props aren't clear.
So like, for example, I'm running an ad, right, for our collagen. Somebody gets to the page and it's a landing page, right? So quite literally you're only scrolling. There's not much to click around to because it's a fully like consolidated in isolation information, right?
And sorry to ask a question, is the add to cart event on the LP, on the landing page?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is but keep going, but this is different.
So I'm scrolling, I'm reading, and you know what? Come down to the buy box. I'm price point maybe not where I want it to be, and cool, I've learned about it, but I'm not ready to buy. And I leave. Does that contribute to
the bounce rate?
Bounce
Yes,
rate?
but this
Got
is
it.
one of those areas where because of the page architecture, you can give yourself the approval to have an acceptable higher bounce rate.
Got it.
Because
Yes.
here's why. That user journey right there is, okay, yep, this is what I'm looking for, generally speaking. But you're not only selling the user to convince you on the USP, you're selling them on the add to cart event.
Yeah.
And think about it, add to cart averages are 12 to 18%. If you're good, you're at 18%, right? Avi trends closer to 20, which means even as an excellent brand, you're losing 80%.
Yeah.
So your bounce rate then gets tethered to your lack of your non-add to cart rate folk. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So that's where you might make the false representation that guys, our bounce rate's too high, and it's like it's not.
It's really not.
It's really not, because again, you have to look at the variable of the page structure.
You got to give that number context on, like
Exactly,
you
yeah,
said, where
well
they're
said.
actually
Right.
at, right? So if your homepage is like 80%, then that means they weren't able to click into maybe a category or a product or use a nav bar, and that's an issue.
They never made it to the product consideration
Exactly,
step, but a
yes.
landing page where you build that into the same page.
Where there's one goal, which is to buy
Get the add to
now,
cart,
that
right.
makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Got
And
it.
the other one to take into consideration is if you have a content-heavy site. So, for instance, if you have a classic blog, right? This is where you actually, not to get too tricky with it, but you want to implement something called an ABR, adjusted bounce rate, where you can actually shift how Google Analytics measures a bounce. And you effectively manipulate it as such, where a bounce is somebody who, as I spoke of before, doesn't engage with the page or leaves before, call it 30 seconds. Because what does the classic blog page show? 90% bounce rate, 95. And you're like, oh, this is terrible. It's not. Think of the purpose of a blog page.
People
you
are
land,
reading.
you read,
Yeah.
and you leave.
That's it.
Right? And so even if people read it and they're like, wow, that was great information, they likely won't engage with anything on the site. So that's where, again, you can adjust actually how the bounce rate is considered on Google Analytics standpoint in order to make it a bit more accurate.
You know what's crazy? I would put a bet on it. If you ask out of 10 e-commerce people what the definition of a bounce rate is, 5 out of 10 would at least say someone who comes to the site and leaves within 5
right away.
seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like people will literally say that sentence.
This is where they mistake exit and bounce rate. Yeah. And again, and it's like, it's all helpful
Isn't that
metrics.
crazy?
But
It's like such an important metric, but it's like the definition is almost like what's your thought process?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And that's, I find it helpful to really think through the user story. So we just went through a few of them there, and most people watching can probably relate to those, right? Landing page strategies, blog, high content, rich sites, et cetera.
I don't think I fully understood it until now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like 2 seconds ago.
Well, the other confusing one, honestly, is session duration too. A lot of people assume session duration is this somebody on it, and they're like, okay, and they're learning. That's not session duration. If I'm on Avi right now, and then you and I continue on with the podcast and start talking, that clock keeps ticking on my session duration, even though I'm not even remotely engaged. So engagement rate, and this is where GA4 is excellent. GA4 does a much better job of identifying this. So you're going to see engagement time. Right, and engagement rate is a way better metric to look at. And it's a little sobering, because again, you'll see 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 50, and that's it. That's all you got out of the actual attention span of the user. Yeah.
See, I was mad that they changed all the terminology on GA4, and I was like, "Fuck this!"
Yeah.
But now it kind of makes sense.
Well, it is different. Remember, it is different though. So engagement rate is different than, and you can still pull up session duration if you want. And by the way, a quick side note: GA4 is going to default to what's called engagement rate. Engagement rate's the other side of the same coin to bounce rate.
Got it.
right? So a bounce is where you don't engage. So an engagement rate is where you do. So they're literally, we literally just inverted the metric in GA4.
Okay.
So a lot of people are now like, oh, I've got a 40% or 35% engagement rate. That's good. It's like, well, not really, because that's the equivalent of like a 65% bounce rate. Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So let's continue. So on the last presentation, and I had a ton of questions about this. We talked about, and this is kind of an ism of Enrock. I obsess about this thing called intra-funnel conversion behavior, right? Which is effectively chunking a website down, because if you think about a website and you talk about conversion rate, introduce XYZ brand and they have a 2.8%, the number one quality to a good metric is that it's actionable. That's more important than anything. If you have a metric you're measuring that you can't action against, it's not a good metric. Don't measure it, right? So conversion rate is a critical metric. But if I tell you this website's 2.8, the problem with that is it doesn't really tell you what to do to make it a 3 or a 4, right? So this is where the beauty of intra-funnel behaviors start coming in, which is you basically segment a website down to say, show me how the homepage is doing at its only job, which is to shuttle somebody from a landing event into a shopping experience. Show me how the PDPs in aggregate are doing at their only job, which is to foster an add to cart click. Show me what the cart's doing. It's its only job, right? To liaise somebody into a checkout, and then of course, show me how the checkout's doing. And you can narrow this down too, right? You can take this down in even micro level events, but looking at those bigger buckets, but still better than just overall conversion rate, this is where the richness lies in conversion rate optimization. So you take a look at this site right here. Now what the averages I'm about to give you do depend on industry, and they depend very much on average order value. So this will change if you're selling pet products versus nutraceuticals versus fashion versus accessory and jewelry. They will change, right? However, as a general rule of thumb, if we're looking at a standard 80 to 100 AOV product, right? Let's assume it's on like the beauty space. You're probably going to be looking at somewhere between a 40 and a 60% homepage intra-funnel rate. That's where you want to be targeting. If you are in the 20s or in the 30s, as an example, that means you are disproportionately underperforming at that step on your site. In other words, where do you go to work tomorrow? Homepage, navigation, landing events. Why? Because that is the weak link that you've identified thus far. Now, moving down the funnel we have here, now you're getting into the aggregate add to cart rate. And again, you need, and I would encourage people to segment this further, start getting into PLP, and I'll show you in one slide how we do this, but PLP add to cart rate versus PDP. A lot of sites, right, we keep the add to cart event on the PLP as well.
Are these pretty easy to like set up? Like when you say, I encourage people to segment it out or separate this data point, is it pretty simple to set up like as a general user?
If your let's talk GA4. If your GA4 is set up properly, let's assume you're a Shopify site and it's integrated properly, a lot of this will pull on its own. Yeah, cool. A lot of it will. Okay. That being said, of the brands I audit, I'd say 1 and 3 are kind of a mess. So we have to go build it for them pretty quickly. Yeah, but nonetheless, so let's talk about add to cart rates. As a general rule of thumb, you want to be between 12 and 18%. That's what I found having done this on. This is probably about between myself and just other industry kind of relationships, between about 500 and 1,000 brands, right? And these are established brands. These are million minimum. The biggest one does about 250 million, right, on their site. So these are bigger brands, right? So 12 to 18% is the general window. Fashion and pet products index quite a bit higher. Fashion tends to index, for instance, between 15 and 23.
People are shopping around, putting different things in their car, and then removing stuff.
Exactly. Shopping is classic example of, I don't want to call it tire kicking in a way, because it's not. That's a negative connotation. But a lot of it is exactly what you said. A lot of fashion buyers will use the add to cart event as a wish list. And so you tend to see an inflated add to cart event for a lot of fashion, especially female fashion, by the way. You see this even more prominent. So for instance, I've got one of my clients, it's women's intimates. Their add to cart rate is like 28%. You know, it just blows everyone out of the water. That being said, they have other areas of the site that are more challenged, but people just love adding things to cart. And a lot of them, you know, they pay for it because on the cart to checkout rate's always a struggle for them. But point being, so again, you kind of want to understand where you're at. And again, if your add to cart rate's coming in at a 7 or at an 8 or a 9 or a 10%, and you're an $85 AOV brand selling, I don't know, whatever, you know, you name it, you probably got some work to do. So again, it's like tomorrow, what do you work on with your team, with your CRO agent? Well, frankly, your CRO agency should be the one driving this conversation, like we talked on last time, leading with data. But this is where you should be focused. And I cannot emphasize this point enough. The amount of times I work with clients where they'll be like, hey, we have an idea. Let's overhaul the homepage. And we're like, you have a 67% homepage interference rate. You're killing it. You're doing awesome there. Not to say there isn't still room for growth. There is. However, it's like, again, it's like you're repainting the shutters on the front of the house and the roof's caving in. It's like, why are we focusing on this?
Right.
Not to say it couldn't be improved, but there's such an obvious metric on fire right in front of us. So you really want to look at this to understand the landscape and to understand where your brand lies, and are you over or under indexed on any one of these? And then that will help you make better decisions on where to focus. Now, one thing I will say again, an add to cart rate, yes, there is because someone's probably thinking this right now, there is a very real inverse relationship between average order value and the add to cart rate especially. That metric is very sensitive. So, we have one client sells furniture effectively, right? Yeah. It's $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $800,000 pieces, items. Their add to cart rate naturally, even post optimization's like a 7, right? So you gotta, and that's good, right, for them. But you gotta look at this through the lenses. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of this is contextual. So you have to understand where your AOV is. But generally speaking, now people have some guardrails to work within. Cart to checkout rate, obviously. Now this is always a big one, because it's kind of like, great, and on the paid media side, a lot of times you guys optimize towards the add to cart event, right, as the actual event that will fire back, which is great. But if a brand has an unusually low performing cart to checkout rate, it's a major leak in the bucket. So cart to checkout rate is one of those I've found most people don't look at hardly at all. And it's a critical metric, because think you just put all this time and effort into getting them to click through, paying the money to Meta as an example. Yeah, getting the intent, selling them on the value propositions, getting them to click in, now they're an engaged user. And then the add to cart is no small feat. I mean, think about that. You don't just haphazardly go on a random e-commerce site and start adding things to cart. Like, no one does that, right? So like, if you generate an add to cart, that is a beautiful leading indication that this person is sincerely interested. Yeah. So to lose 70-something% of that audience on the next step is like inexcusable, right? And so I notice a lot of brands just kind of look at their cart as this utilitarian feature that just, it's just got to be there because it's got to be there. We already got the add to cart, and they don't really pay much attention to it. Or they skip over it and jump right into checkout optimization, which is needed, but focus on the cart and measure it properly. So this again varies based on AOV, but once again, you want to be seeing at least 45%. You really want to be seeing at least 45, which I know may sound low, but the reality of it is a lot of people will be kind of high up on the price elasticity scale, and even though they're excited about your product, the cart's the first place they start getting cold feed. So you got to understand that metric is rarely in like the 70s or 80s, again, depending on the brand and the average order value and such. You will also, here's another thing, all of these metrics I'm talking about will fluctuate and will alter based on promotional windows. So I challenge everybody, go look at these numbers during Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and you'll be psyched to see what you see. Like, a lot of these will go up 20, 30, 50%, right? Why? Because it's Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So another word of caution, when you're looking at historical metrics here, your last million users, your last a million sessions or whatever it is, 100,000 sessions, make sure the window you're looking at is a clean window. Right. Because a lot of times I'll see brands do that. They'll be like, what do you mean our metric's this? And it's like, because 60% of that lift was driven by these 2 days where you had like the sale of the century going on, Or the other direction, you ran out of your inventory and your best-selling product. Right. So what does that do? It'll artificially compress not artificial because it's real, but you see what I mean? It'll throw off a false negative that your add to cart rate's actually plummeting when it's really just a function of an inventory issue. And then lastly is getting into checkout transaction rate. Again, this is majorly where those on the price elasticity scale tend to get sensitive, right? And so you'll see abandonment right here. What I have found is that there are 2 main reasons for checkout abandonment. One is price elasticity, as we mentioned. It's just fancy terminology for people who just are just don't want to justify, or they can't justify spending that money today, right? They kind of convince themselves out of it. And the second one is urgency. I can't tell you how many times, I've even done this as a consumer. I have a fashion brand I like. I did this not long ago, right? I've done it a few times to them where they sent an email, some new drop or whatever, and I was like, oh, I like that. I went, added to cart, it was totally within budget. I had no problem buying it, and I just didn't because I got busy with an email, or I just got carried on with my day. It just wasn't that important.
Right.
Now, we're doing this with a mutual brand that you guys introduced me to, and everyone would know who they are. It's an extremely large fashion brand. And we're focusing right now on, because they've got this brilliant free gift opportunity right? Where if you hit over a certain price threshold, they give away a free gift as an example. So what we're experimenting with is how do you introduce a scarcity element? How do you almost put the fear of loss on the user that like, yeah, we're going to give you a free gift
do this now
if you check out now. So it's like rule number one in a negotiation, there's got to be a two-way thing. So if you're going to be offering your customers free expedited shipping or some above average, a free gift, et cetera, they should do something too, right? Which usually comes in the form of expedited checkout, right? So really, really important there to look at.
What about, you're saying urgency, then you're saying pricing, but what about shipping?
Shipping. Okay, so let's talk about that. So this is actually, I'm going to fast forward here up to this slide. So we're just talking about more broader stroke intrafunnel conversion rates. Now let's get into micro behavior. So let's tackle checkout. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing you want to do is measure the literal conversion rate of every step. So show me how many people that landed on checkout actually entered their email. Let's assume it's a Shopify checkout, right? So everyone knows that typical email field at the top. How many successfully entered their email? Let's just start there. Right? That's usually where a lot of brands get their abandonment rate, right? A lot of brands, they'll do brilliantly after you enter the email, but then they have a 30% conversion rate or 40% conversion rate, people even entering the email. So what does that mean? Now you're like, okay, well, it's definitely an urgency problem, right? They saw the price on cart and on PDP, and then they're like, I was in that example. I'll just do it later, whatever. It's not that important.
Right.
Oftentimes you'll see that rate maybe looks okay, and then you'll look down and you'll see, as to your point, exactly like we can see on the screen here, you get to the shipping section and you'd see an unusual drop off. Well, that will answer that question once and for all. Is the shipping charge you have, if you have it, really that impactful? Right. And don't assume it is. I've seen a lot of brands where people are like happy to pay it, happy to pay it, right?
Yep.
So there's that too. I know I'm throwing a lot here, but there's just so much to go into, right?
No,
the other factor on this is, especially when you're looking at checkout intrafunnel behavior, is you have to break down the difference between new users versus returning users, especially here. The reason why is, what is an example of a returning user who starts their session on checkout? It's an abandoned cart recovery. It's exactly the classic example. You put your email in, and then you get that email automation that's like, hey, Ash, you left, well, they wouldn't know your name, but they're like, hey, you left this in your cart, and then you click on it, and then where do you land? Back on the checkout. So that is a new session which begins on the checkout page, which has very different behavior, because oftentimes you do what? You arm them with a coupon code. So you've got to also, to make sure you're not assuming you're good here when you're not, is to understand the difference between new users or returning users, especially when they're coming from an abandoned series. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so really important, everybody looks at that, right, to really segment these metrics down.
I know we talked about shipping last time, but there's just a tidbit that we actually ran. We did this test with PDQ, right, where we were split testing some of the shipping options, right? And so what we were trying to do is, one, can we increase AOV by also increasing conversion rate by like offering these different options, right? So one of them was, how do we tackle the first time customers and get them through the door, where they're kind of like expecting to pay shipping, but it's like surprise and a delight, where it's like, oh, well, you actually unlock free shipping, right? Okay. I think that was the biggest issue for us, because one, beginning of the year, we introduced charging for shipping. Yeah. And we kind of had to, just to cover the cost. Yep. But when we started doing this test, I think there was like a 4% lift in conversion and AOV, because people were actually like, cool, I'm actually getting a surprise and delight here. And a lot of people don't realize how much you could actually test in the checkout. Yeah. Right? Because it's like, yeah, you can test the product page, you can test your cart, but within checkout, a lot of people don't realize that you can actually test the elements there.
Yeah, you can. It's a bit dependent on what CMS you use and then what plan you're on. Yeah. So unfortunately, if you're on just like Shopify Basic, you're a little bit handcuffed there. You know, this is assuming you're on Shopify Plus, right? Yeah. But yes, absolutely. And frankly, on top of it, I don't have a checkout page up here, but maybe we'll show one. The classic Shopify page, if you can envision it, has that whole right section on the pricing field. That's empty. Yes. And it's like, why? That's empty real estate that you could be using to continue selling the user. And a lot of people just assume when they got there that, again, it's just a utilitarian function. Yeah. It's just a transactional element, and it's like, it's not. Yeah. You've got to sell them as hard there as you did on the homepage. Yeah. Remind them about that 60-day money back guarantee you have or whatever, or that you have incredible, customer service or free worldwide shipping or whatever. I just literally audited a brand this morning and they had incredible value props. I mean, I was like, how do you guys even make money with all, I mean, they were giving away free gifts and all these guarantees and warranties and you name it. There was no mention of it in the cart, in the checkout, anywhere. It was only on the PDP. And I was like, the average user's completely forgotten or didn't even notice it.
Yeah.
So you got to use what real estate you have to keep selling the user.
I think Shopify made it a little unfair for like users where, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Shopify, but Shopify Plus, right, where you could completely customize the checkout. I think now they move towards that extensibility checkout, and you can actually now go through the App Store and find the different widgets that you want to add, right? Whether it's the countdown or like the USPs where it's like the 5,000 5-star or 90-day guarantee or whatever it is. And I think it's now more accessible to everybody else now.
Yeah, it definitely is. And again, it's like it's changed a bit, right? So when they made that update, and they've also pushed a ton of brands into single page checkout, right? So that's another one. So again, you got to,
A lot of people are getting that rolled out too.
Yeah, you got to take that recommendation again, but the point still remains, which is checkout is not just a transactional feature. It is an opportunity for you to continue selling your value props.
I think there is one thing though that I feel like is more of just a stigma that's been going towards, that's happening a lot, is just people being like, oh well, I want to keep it simple and clean. And I think the change that needs to happen is CRO or optimizing your checkout isn't correlated to making it like clunky and doesn't look good. It's just actually figuring out the features that need a little bit of a lift or optimization. And it can still look good. They're beautiful looking checkout pages that are optimized incredibly well. But I feel like, again, even just when I talk to certain people, like even on a MentorPass call, it'll just be like, oh, well, we just want to keep it clean. We want to keep it, and it's like, you hear that so much, and I'm like, what does that even mean?
The opportunity to continue selling, right? A lot of people don't, which I think is stupid. 2, there's an opportunity to upsell as well, right? You're already in the checkout. You already have your credit card out. Can you get them with like, all right, get this one more item that complements what you're ordering, so you can improve your AOV without really, hurting conversion rate. And then, like I said, the PDQ stuff that we did, that VIP processing. Add like $2 more on top of your AOV just to like ship out today. Right. So just these small things to improve the AOV while maintaining conversion rate, I feel like is a no-brainer.
Well, for sure. And a lot of brands jump to the conclusion, to your point, where they're like, well, they're worried about their consumer reaction. And what I would say with anything you're hearing from me is this is all in the spirit of experimentation.
A/B test it.
Right. So the point is like, what do you have to lose? Right. I mean, absolute worst case scenario, you take a segment of users and you shift basically a variant to them and they have a slightly different experience and it loses. Let's assume it really loses. You don't even have to wait till statistical significance. If the directional readouts are showing that it's like gonna tank, I mean, okay, sure, maybe you lost some revenue from a segment of users there, and I understand that, but like at what cost to not test at all? And I can't tell you how many brands we've tested and completely disproven what their original hypothesis was. And that's the best part about this is it's like, great, let's challenge what we believe and what we don't believe to see what works.
And I think, I don't know if you remember, you'd said this, maybe it was like meeting number 4 or 5 when we first started with you. I think we were maybe testing like checkout upsells or something, and it maybe didn't work. And I think you had said, it was you or Alex, but you guys had said something like, well, we're going to test it until we can find a way to make it work. Right. And I think it's like that whole concept is also true, because the other thing I also hear is like, oh, we tested that, it didn't work. And it's like, well, what else did you test? Then? Like,
why didn't it work?
It's not just an A/B. An A/B test is also very like, is almost triggering people to be so black and white, and it's actually way more nuanced than that.
Correct.
So if you can touch on that, I think it'd be good for people to like stop their process of A/B being black white and being A, B, C, D, E. Like it's way more than that.
It is, right. And it also kind of cuts you off at the knees at the best part of this whole thing. Like, growing revenue is great, but it's also the learnings you get as to your consumer and how they react and what they like from a behavioral, psychological standpoint.
That's right.
Is amazing, right? And it will, it has all these ancillary benefits, because then even when you go back into the shop to redesign and reformulate the next generation line of products, you keep all that data in the back of your mind. So even these A/B tests that have won or lost, whatever, that will craft even the packaging, it'll craft everything that you guys do, right? Even future brands, right? So it's really, really important. To give you an anecdote kind of on this one, we had a client who fought us really hard because we were recommending a order by, receive by feature, which is like, you see on the PDP, it's like, order today, get it by next Monday or whatever it was. And they were like, that doesn't work. And we were like, okay, like cool, like I'm all about it, sure.
I mean,
and so they had
Amazon,
run a test.
it's on Amazon.
Right. But again, just out of respect, I'm like, okay, like what? Just show me the data on it. And they did run a test, and it did not work.
Really?
However, they had an icon that said ships by. That's very different than receive by.
Yeah.
So you see what I mean there? That's where it's like, okay,
it's little
yes, because users don't really care. Like when you ship it, they want to know when they get
it.
They don't care if you ship it tomorrow or even Friday or Monday. If you ship it Monday but you're going to get it Tuesday, that's the same to them as you shipping today and getting it Tuesday. They do not care.
Delivery.
Right. So this is again one of those ones where it's exactly to your point. Had they run variable experimentation after it, they would have likely led to a win that we didn't even have to recommend. Months or I don't know what it was.
That's a great anecdote on that.
Yeah.
I know we talked a lot about GA3. I want to know a little bit more about how to set it up on GA4, so I think we're going to have to talk about that on the next episode. But choose at the end of every episode, takeaways for the users. What is one thing that you want everybody to kind of take away and chew on in terms of this?
Honestly, I think Ron had the best point of this whole bit, which is keep experimenting until you either win or you have a definitive learning. And I don't mean learning. The learning isn't, it lost. The learning is our users, for whatever reason, are hypersensitive to X or tend to adopt to Y, et cetera. Have a really concrete. And then the second one I would say to chew on is look at all the things you're measuring today in your business. And number one, if it's not something you can action, stop measuring it. It's just wasting your time.
Wow.
Chew on that. That's good.
If you want more from us, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow us on TikTok, and check out the website chewonthis.io.